Hey guys, I'm Jason Brubaker. I'd like to welcome you to The Power of Personal Projects. Now, I used to have this only on Gumroad and Patreon, but I wanted to just put it out there for everybody on YouTube because recently in my life, I've experienced the next step of the power of personal projects, and I want to share that with you at the very end of this video. So grab some popcorn, kick back and relax, and enjoy the show. So this presentation is kind of my approach to my artistic career, and it's what I suggest that artists do as well. Let's get started. I've gone from cartoons to illustration to comics to storyboards to animation to visual development, and then a self-publisher. People wonder, what's my secret? This is my secret. And this may seem like a no-brainer, but I'm serious. People don't treat it this way. So just hang in there. So love what you do, so that you can put in the time. If you don't love it, you'll never put in the time to be able to get good at it. When you love it, you can put in the time, and then in turn, you'll be able to finish something, right? You can only finish something if you love it and you put in the time. And then if you finish something, doors can open for you. If you can't finish something, you'll never be able to put it out there, and doors will never be allowed to open because no one will have seen what you love to do. So that's the strategy. And then you just repeat this. You start the new thing that you love to do so that you can put in the time, so that you can finish it, so that the doors can open. And then you keep doing this. That's been my whole art career, basically. That's the pattern I've used. And I wasn't even aware of it for a long time, but that's what I've seen looking back on my career. So where did this all start for me? Well, I grew up in Idaho and Utah, so you can see some different places on the map. They're all small towns, and it's great growing up in these places. I live in Pocatello right now even, but there was a problem with growing up in these places wanting to be an artist. What was the problem? Well, there was no art jobs. And even living in Pocatello now, there are no real art jobs here. I would have to do everything on the internet. But this is getting off subject. But what was my response? My response as a kid was, should I just give up because there's no art jobs here? No, my response was, who cares? I don't care if there's no jobs here. I like to draw. I like to tell stories. I drew because I loved it. I loved drawing. And I filled up notebook and notebook after notebook of stories like this. And my mom still has a big box of tons and tons of stories that I've drawn when I was a kid. I told stories because I loved it. I drew because I loved it. I told stories because I loved it. And here's a little example of a story. I forgot I did this, but it was actually prose and comic hybrid. And I when I saw this, I was like, wow, that's exactly what I'm trying to do right now. I wasn't very good at it yet, but I didn't care. I kept doing it because, again, I loved it. Like, look at this comic. It's stick figures, you know? It was just fun to tell these stories in this weird way. I made some characters, Spud, Slither, Spunk. They all kind of look like in the Garfield world. This brings me to a quote that I wrote in my book called Unnatural Talent. And the quote is this: talent is created and it grows when you're overly passionate about your specific subject. Right? I don't believe you're born with talent. I believe you're born with a passion for something, or you can get a passion. The thing that you're so interested in that you fall in love with is kind of the gift. But your talent comes out of being so passionate about these things that you study it more and you obsess over it more than anyone else. So thousands of hours later and hundreds of comic strips later, I got caught. You thought I was going to say I got better, but I got caught. I was at school. I was in 5th grade, and Mr. Ferguson saw me drawing in my notebook comic strips day after day. And what did he say? He said, "You should put those in the newspaper." And I said, "Really?" And he's like, "Yeah, I got friends there. I'm friends with the editor." And so he brought me down to the local paper, and he introduced me to the editor, and he showed the editor my comics. And this was in Brigham City, so it was a small town, 15,000 people. So he brought me down to the local newspaper, and he showed my comic to the editor. And that brings me to one of my favorite quotes, which is by an ancient Roman philosopher. It says, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." And so how does that relate to me, and how does that relate to this situation? Well, I had been working on comics for years at that time. I mean, I was a little kid, and I had entire books full of this comic called Scruffy. So what happened was the editor said, "I will publish your comic if you can deliver one every week, I will publish it. So at the age of 11, I became a local comic cartoonist. Here's a bunch of clippings from the newspaper. But that was a big deal. That was huge for me. And it really showed me that I could do this. And everyone in the town knew me as Scruffy from that point on. So a couple years later, we moved. We moved to Pocatello, and I left Scruffy behind because I was kind of tired of being called Scruffy. And actually, I got into comic books. My dad gave me a couple Spider-Man comics when I was in junior high, and it just kind of ignited a whole new imagination for me, and I just started falling in love with comic artists. So I started making my own comics. I was trying to, copy everything that I saw. This was my first attempt at making a comic. It was called Mega Force. I colored it with markers. I actually convinced my art teacher, to let me finish this comic as an art assignment for one of the final assignments. And he said, yeah, so I finished this 22-page comic, partially in school, and I just put everything I could into it. I was in junior high at the time. I wasn't very good, I mean, these are okay. They're better than what I could have done before, but I loved it, and I loved doing it, and I finished it. And I finished this thing, and I got a grade on it. This is another one I made. This was a Spider-Man one, same thing. I did it with markers. I drew it on copy paper, made a photocopy, and then I colored it with markers. But as hard as I was working on these and as much as I loved it, I knew I was missing something. This is when I started developing this thing that I now call cognitive drawing. The problem was I would look at these amazing comic artists, and I would be like, how can I get Jim Lee or Todd McFarlane to look over my shoulder and show me what I'm doing wrong? If that could happen, if I could get someone of that caliber, I would be able to improve so much faster. Not like that, kid. Do it this way. Thanks, Todd. Then one day I realized that I could, in a way, get all my favorite artists to help me. I had this idea that if I were to reverse engineer the process, it would go something kind of like this. Find a small section of art that I really wanted to learn to draw, like an arm or hand or face or eyeball. And then I would cover it up immediately. I wouldn't study it. I would just see something that I wanted to be able to get to that level. And the reason I would cover it up is because I wanted to do it as from my imagination the best I could without any point of reference other than maybe the angle that the image is. And so I would do the drawing as good as I can, and then I would reveal the reference image that I wanted to copy like. And so in essence, it was kind of like whoever drew that picture was saying, you did it this way, but this is the way you should do it. This is the way I do it. And then you start connecting the dots. And it's really simple, but what this showed me is when I would do this, my brain would really start paying attention to these subtle differences in things. And it really trained me to imitate different styles. And so, I would repeat it again. I would cover everything up, draw it again from memory, this retaining some of the things I practiced when I was copying it, and then I would try it again from the reference, and I'd just keep repeating that. This whole process really forced my brain to see the difference, and I used it all the time. I used it as a professional even. Now, I'm not approving of someone copying one style. I always tell people, if you copy one style, then you're a clone. If you copy 10, 20 of your favorite styles, then your style starts forming out of that. And so I believe that's how my style formed, was by doing this, imitating all my favorite artists, and it ended up becoming my style. To get really good at anything, there is this idea that there's a 10,000 hour rule. And I think this was coined by Malcolm Gladwell in a book, Outliers, I believe. And he says that in order to become professional at anything, you have to put in 10,000 hours. And I know a lot, especially for the young people, we're thinking, oh my goodness, there's no way I'm going to get to 10,000 hours on this thing. This is ridiculous. But if you just break it down, if you're working 8 hours a day, in 3.5 years, you can be a professional at anything, right? And so if you're young, if you're a teenager and you put in 4 hours a day, if you're a grade schooler and you start putting in a couple hours a day, those hours really add up fast. You can see in the background my sketches of me trying to draw this girl's face, and this was out of a Shade the Changing Man book by Chris Boccello or Boccolo. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he's one of my favorite artists, and I was imitating him. So when I was in high school, I finally created my first comic, and it was this thing called Phobos, and it was like a 22-page comic. I went to Kinko's. I printed 50 copies of it. I sold all of them at the local comic shop. Then I printed some more, and I sent them to small comic publishers that I could find. I just went through the comic shop and found every small indie comic publisher that there was, and I sent it out to every single one I could find. It was a lot of work, and it cost me some of my own personal money, but I did it. And sure enough, a comic publisher, a small indie publisher, liked what I was doing, and they saw that I had actually finished something, and they said, okay, we'll publish this. So they used the cover from Phobos #2, and because they liked it better, and they published Phobos #1, and this was a nationwide publication. It got a lot of press around the town. Locally, I was on the news.
19-year-old Jason Brubaker recently had his original strip put out by a company in Florida. It's a spoof of old horror movie characters featuring a vampire, a Frankenstein monster, and a werewolf, all who find themselves in spooky, kooky situations.
Most comics have big, muscly superheroes that are just out of proportion, and they're all serious, but you can't really get into it because they're so serious and they're so screwed up looking. But I think mine, it's just kind of a bunch of weird stuff, and people like it.
You can check out Brubaker's Goofy Ghouls at Ozone Comics in Pocatello. Brubaker now has his sights set on someday working for Marvel Comics doing Spider-Man.
I was in the local paper. There was a big write-up about it, and look at me with my sporting hairdo. It was amazing. It was a really big deal. But with all those positive things, there's also some difficult things. And Phobos 2 was canceled. They said, sorry, we can't publish anymore. My art teacher at the time told me that there was no money in comics and that I should paint wildlife instead. Depending on where you live, that could be interpreted as a joke or it could be serious. Like here in Idaho, that's a serious statement. But anywhere else in the art world, it's kind of, to my experience, that's a joke. But I'm sorry to offend anyone there. But the problem was I hated painting wildlife. I didn't want to do that, so why would I do that? I was graduating high school soon, and so I needed to find a real job. So this was the crushing reality of the situation. Well, I got jobs at the local supermarket and all that stuff, but I still pursued comics, and there was this artist named Tim Bradstreet that he was doing White Wolf role-playing game art for Vampire the Masquerade. And I told my friends, like, I can do that stuff. All he's doing is tracing. He's taking pictures and he's tracing it. And they're like, yeah, right, show me. And so I said, okay, well, let's set up a camera. Let me figure out how to do this. So I took some pictures of me and my friends. I blew it up on a photocopier, and then I put a piece of paper over it, and I light tabled it. I traced over it, and I inked it, and I did cross-hatching, and it looked great. And sure enough, like, my friends were like, wow, you could do that. And so later on, we went to the San Diego Comic Book Convention, and my friends went over to the White Wolf booth, and they said, see that artist right there, Tim Bradstreet? My friend can do exactly that style. And they're like, yeah, right, prove it. And so they ran across the convention and found me. This was in like 1995 or something. And they found me and they said, White Wolf wants to see your art. And so I was like, okay. So I went over to White Wolf, and they're like, their friends say you can draw like Tim Bradstreet. And I was like, I guess. So I pulled open my portfolio and showed them, and they hired me right there on the spot. They couldn't believe it because I was a young 18-year-old kid drawing like their number one artist, their cover artist. That continued for about a year or so. I did a bunch of art for about 5 books of theirs, and as you can see, I started using airbrush and stuff like that. And that was my first like real art job. It didn't pay very much at all, but it was a real job, and I was published. I was illustrating books, and I was published in a really prominent publication at the time. So what I learned from this was tracing isn't a bad thing. I used to think you were breaking the rules of art if you traced. But, come to find out, like, you can actually do art for a living if you trace, and actually started learning a lot by tracing and using a light table. My comic art improved by leaps and bounds as well, because I started drawing my comics and then tracing over my drawings. It made my art improve like crazy. Like suddenly it wasn't me trying to figure it out all on the same piece of paper. And because I put in that time to draw it and then trace over it, I started producing work like this now. This is what I consider my best comic book submission. It was for the Wildcats book by Jim Lee, and they had a contest, and I spent like 2 weeks working on 4 pages for them. And this is some of the art from it. And I'm still really impressed with this. I still think this is a great piece of work. I sent it to Jim Lee, but I also sent it to editors and artists at Marvel and DC. And I started just doing this process of of doing 4-page submissions and sending it to as many people as I could. And usually I would send it to about 30 different editors or artists or comic publishers. I went to comic conventions and I stood in every portfolio review line I could find. And eventually, the last day of Comic-Con, I wanted to stand in one more line. There was a DC editor's line. It was on Sunday, the last day. My friends were ready to go, and it was a long line. I said, I just want to stand in this one more line. So I stood in this one line. When I got done, the guy gave me a card and said he liked my stuff, but there wasn't anything available right now, or whatever he said, I don't remember. But as soon as I got out of the line, I was pulled aside by a Hollywood agent who represented storyboard artists. And he told me, I've been standing behind this guy just watching everyone that he critiques. And whenever he gives a card to someone, it means he's serious about it and he likes their work. And I'll also be looking at their work too over his shoulder. But I'll pull those people aside and see if they're interested in doing storyboards for a living. And he pulled open this binder of all these artists he represented, and it was amazing. It blew my mind because it was such great high caliber. And he told me that they pay him hundreds of dollars a day. And at that time, it was another thing that blew my mind. And I was like, how could that be possible? And he's like, if you can move to LA, I can get you represented to do storyboards and I could get you work consistently. And so about 4 months later, I moved to Los Angeles. I got my car fixed up. I settled all the debts I had, or if I had any. I packed everything I could into a $400 Honda Prelude that was like 20 years old at the time. And I was 20 years old at the time. And I drove by myself with just a couple boxes of things that I owned to LA, stayed with some friends of friends of friends, and went in and met with this agency. And sure enough, they got me a job on a movie called Boogie Boy, which lasted for a couple weeks. But the very first job that I actually went to was a storyboarding job for a Doritos commercial. So basically, they represented me for like 6 years until I left. They were giving me so much work. It was a company called Famous Frames. They got me onto TV shows doing pilots and pitches. This was for, I don't remember, CSI or something. I did hundreds of jobs for commercials and TV shows. I worked with just so many directors that I started learning all these different approaches to telling stories. And I started realizing that these directors didn't really know more than me about how to tell a story. They're actually relying on me to tell stories. They rely on their storyboard artist and the cinematographer to figure out most of the angles. Unless you're a real hands-on director, which they're a pleasure to work with when they really know what they want. But for the most part, it's all about me just making up these angles and trying to tell a story. So I worked on all kinds of stuff. This was a commercial by John Lindauer. He's one of my better friends. He was actually the guy who hired me for the Doritos commercial, and we've been friends ever since. He really liked my comic book style, and so he would always push me into like trying to do comic book type stuff. So this was a commercial that he directed, and I storyboarded. The things I learned through this process was, let's just add to the list. Do what you love to do so that you can finish something, so that you can put in the 10,000 hours it requires to become professional at something, so that you can be prepared for an opportunity. And when the doors open, the thing is, it's just never what you expect it to be. At least in my experience, it never is. But doors do open. And I also learned that everyone traces. So, I mean, storyboarding was riddled with tracers. Your main arsenal was tracing paper and black Prismacolor pencils. And that's what got the drawings to look like this. This was all tracing paper and black Prismacolor pencils. So after 6 years, I was bored of doing storyboards. So I decided to work on a personal project again. I felt like there was something missing. So I decided to work on a personal project again. I started planning to animate my own short film. And it was this animation, which later became Remind. But it was called Tender Vittles 3.2. It was a joke. It doesn't make any sense. But I started working on the short film. I didn't know how to do much other than storyboarding, so I storyboarded the whole thing out. And these are some of the examples of the storyboards. But there was a problem with this whole idea of making a piece of animation. And the problem was I couldn't animate. I had no idea how to animate. I'd never done it before. I didn't know any software for it. This was before I could even get software for it. I didn't even have a computer at this time. But I wanted to animate. And so what was my response? I think you should know by now what the response is. Who cares, right? I loved The idea of learning to animate, I loved the idea of animating something. I didn't care if I didn't know how to do it. I was going to do it. So I obsessed on this animation, and I worked on it, and I used tracing paper because it's all I knew how to use. And I did it in the most cumbersome, difficult way ever imaginable. I finally got a computer, I got Photoshop, I got After Effects. My director friend John Lindauer showed me how to use After Effects and Photoshop a little bit because he was doing a commercial that way. I started putting together some animation. 5 years later, I finally had like 15 minutes of animation. A lot of it was bad, but there was a little chunk of it that I feel like was the best that I had done. And I would like to show that to you now. Now, I'm actually oversimplifying this because the animation you just saw was me redoing it several times and learning things from what I'm going to talk about next. So once I finished a short clip, I showed it to everyone I could. I showed it to that director, my director friend. He actually had another friend who was a director who needed an animator. And so he suggested me because they both knew my work ethic. They both knew that I could do storyboards. So they're like, well, let's give him a shot animating. So I got hired to do a Barbie commercial, and they didn't even look at my animation. They just hired me on the spot, like, here, do a motion test for us. So I broke out my tracing paper. I had no idea what I was doing, but somehow we got this Barbie motion test working. We spent a weekend on it, and the studio got awarded these Barbie commercials, and I was responsible for animating. So what in the world was I going to do here? Well, I'll get back to that. Needless to say, more commercials happened out of that. I started art directing, and I started directing animation, and I completely quit doing storyboards because I had worked on this personal project of animating my thing, but it turned into all this work that I was getting. The unexpected doors that opened here was I was able to hire ex-Disney animators to help me, because at this time Disney had just finished their last 2D animation film, and they said, we're closing the doors on our animation studio, and everyone was out of a job or they had to go learn 3D. So I was in a position where we needed animators. I had a lot of animation to do. I didn't know how I'd get it done, and so we just put the word out we needed to hire animators. And so I was interviewing professional Disney animators, and we filled this little studio with these animators, and they demanded actual animation desks, and they demanded all this stuff. So we got some cheap ones and set them all up and got the animation paper. And I basically learned how to animate on the job from the best in the industry. And I would sit by ladies who were doing in-betweens, and I would see if I could do some of the in-betweens with them, and I would ask them questions. I would sit with people who were animating, and I'd ask them questions. I would try to do some of the animation. I learned so much from that. I finally got really good at animation. And that's really where that Remind clip that you just saw came from, is after I had redone my animation multiple times from learning on the job like this, my animation started looking good. So in addition to that, I started pitching TV shows because I was around all these people who were pitching, and I was like, okay, well, I can do that too, So I started pitching animation ideas. I developed this one on the left was called Malice and Plunder, about 2 ferrets. I developed short animations, and I tried to pitch them. And I went into several studios and pitched different things. Cartoon Network, Nickelodeon, Disney TV, to name a couple. And it was a really interesting learning experience, a fun time, and I learned a lot about pitching during that. And during that process, I got advice that sent me in a new direction. The direction was, maybe you should do comics, because animation takes so many people and it takes so long, but you can create your ideas and put them into a comic and get them out into the world faster. I didn't like the idea at first, but I went to San Diego Comic-Con again. After 10 years of not going, I looked around and I got kind of inspired again to start working on a comic. And so Remind was reborn, or Remind was born out of this idea of converting my animation into a comic. I worked on the first chapter for years and years and years, probably about 3 years on and off, on weekends and when I wasn't working. I didn't really know what to do with it, but I just loved it. This was my personal project now. This was my passion, side project now. I just kept working on it. I didn't know what would come from it, but I figured something would come from it. So some unexpected doors that opened was on these freelance animation jobs, we would hire, again, the best animators we could. And one job we hired James Baxter, who is, in my opinion, the best animator in America on American cartoon type stuff. He is just amazing. Look him up if you haven't heard of him. A legend animator, basically. So we hired James Baxter to animate some commercials that our art directed. So I worked with him closely.
I write underground comics, and I got my latest idea at work. The Actuary. By day, just a mild-mannered CPA, crunching numbers, deciphering the tax code, spreadsheets. But at night, a crime-solving mathematician with laser vision. I do it all on my computer. Write, draw, publish online. He may not always get his man, but he always gets the girl.
Start something heroic. Start anything you like with a world of software and devices that run on Windows.
So we hired James Baxter to animate some commercials that our art directed. So I worked with him closely. He was kind of impressed with how I was using his animation in the computer. And so he would ask me to come every now and then to show him, give him a little demo or a little tutorial of how I was using certain software at his personal studio. And then the next year, he hired me to help him with the opening of this movie called Kung Fu Panda. And I didn't know Kung Fu Panda would be Kung Fu Panda. I mean, honestly, I just thought it was some other animated movie. But it turned out to be an amazing movie. So this is what we did. And I was one of the 2 compositors who worked on this. I composited half of these shots, background animation and like effects and lighting and camera moves, and a lot of the background characters that were in my shots, I animated myself, and James Baxter would give me direction. But all the characters that were drawn and animated on paper were drawn by James Baxter. Here you go.
Legend tells of a legendary warrior whose kung fu skills were the stuff of legend. He traveled the land in search of worthy foes. I see you like to chew. Maybe you should chew on my fist! The warrior said nothing, for his mouth was full. Then he swallowed. And then he spoke. Enough talk. Let's fight. Shafabui! He was so deadly, in fact, that his enemies would go blind from overexposure to pure awesomeness.
He's too awesome!
And attractive.
How can we repay you?
There is no charge for awesomeness or attractiveness. Blow it! It mattered not how many foes he faced. They were no match for his bodacity. Never before had a panda been so feared and so loved. Even the most heroic heroes in all of China, the Furious Five, bowed in respect to this great master.
We should hang out.
Agreed. But hanging out would have to wait, because when you're facing the 10,000 demons of Demon Mountain, there's only one thing that matters, and that's...
Oh?
Get up!
You'll be late for work!
What?
So after that, the whole James Baxter studio was brought into Dreamworks, and we all basically started working at Dreamworks from that point on. I was freelance, but since I had those relationships, those doors were opened. I said, hey guys, I don't just do animation, I actually do art too. So I talked to my art director and I said, can I show you my art? Because I'd love to do viz dev, what you guys are doing here. And he said, you do art? And I go, yeah, I do art. He's like, okay, give me your portfolio. So I showed him the pages, the first chapter of Remind, my graphic novel that I was working on, and a bunch of other random things that I had done over the years. And he's like, wow, you can draw. Okay, well, let me see if we can get you in as viz dev. Sure enough, I was able to get the job as viz dev. And this was the very first viz dev painting I did. And this took me quite a few weeks, and it took a lot of training to get me to be able to paint with these rock textures the way they wanted in the style that they wanted. This is more viz dev art for Kung Fu Panda 2. This was me painting what the textures would look like for the models, and we made a nice version and a rough version. And then this is called color keys. So a scene was created, and it was planned out in 3D. But it was just gray art with nothing fancy on it. And it was my job and the viz dev crew's job to do these things called color keys. And this was kind of the blueprint for how they would light the shot based on our color keys. So I learned how to do color keys and color theory. This is an example of a shot where I had to design this set. I built the set in 3D in Maya. I was trained how to do that. I put in these characters, and then I took a screenshot of it, and then I painted over it in Photoshop. And this is the same set, but from a different angle. Again, I built it in 3D, painted over it in Photoshop. This was for the third movie. The art director, Tang Heng, was really having trouble trying to come up with the style for the shadow puppet scene in the beginning. And I wasn't supposed to do this, but one weekend I had an idea of how I thought it should be done. And so I came in early that Monday, and I made this painting, and I showed it to him, and I said, I think this works. And he got real excited, and basically this painting became kind of the style for the whole shadow puppet scene. And I was given probably about 70% of those scenes to draw, if my memory serves me correctly. So a lot of those shadow puppet sequences I drew, and I created the art for it and the characters, and there's even some that I animated. So I like to tell people that there's some scenes in Kung Fu Panda 2 that I did completely by myself. I drew all the art, and I composited it, and I animated it. I just didn't do the sound design or the voices. This is another example of a color key. So this was a scene that was just all gray, black and white, and no lighting. And I was responsible for making the lighting look the way it was supposed to look. I followed the art direction of Ramon Zebach, who was in charge of the whole color script. And this looked beautiful, but I give them a lot of credit for the direction. This was another scene where I actually created the set. I designed it. I designed all the little props in it and the etchings and all that stuff, and then I made a painting based on that for the sequence. This sequence was never in it. This is another set that I completely created and designed all the details on this thing, all the little details painted on the wood. I didn't build this one in 3D, but I designed it. Someone else built it in 3D. And it was never used. This was the scroll sequence for Kung Fu Panda 3. And all of us artists worked on different chunks of that, but we had a style we worked with. So this was one of the images from that I designed. This was a sequence in Kung Fu Panda 3 where there's these jade zombies that are attacking this village, and I thought it'd be really cool to have them bust through the ice at one point, and you cut to them underwater, walking under the water. And so I pitched this, and people loved it, but I don't think it ended up being in the movie. I think one of the most epic feel-good moments that I've ever had in my professional career was when I was asked to create the intro to Kung Fu Panda 3 in a really cool comic book intense style, because Ramon had seen my comic books, and he's like, I want you to bring that kind of energy. The intro's really lacking right now. And so I spent about 2 weeks designing, storyboarding, and doing viz dev on the intro. The thing that was the coolest was when I got done, I pitched it in front of a group of people. Like there was a movie, there's a movie screen. There's a room full of the crew and everybody. You're in the back with a computer projecting it onto the computer screen, and you have a microphone, and you're pitching your idea to everyone in a dark theater type of room. And I'd never really done much of that before, but the response was so amazing that it's addictive. But it was one of the last things I really did, and before I left DreamWorks. Anyway, so I'm going to pitch it to you, kind of how I pitched it. And this is the first version. I don't know if I have the second version, which just kind of takes it a little further on things. But if you watch the movie, you'll see what the final version looked like, because they went shot by shot. It's like exactly what I did, pretty much. And it's pretty rewarding to see that come through and actually be in the final movie. So imagine you're in a dark theater and I'm in the back with a microphone, and this is how I'm pitching it to you. We open up with sliding screens, and we see Kung Fu Panda putting on his hat. And then other sliding screens move across, and suddenly he takes off running. His feet are moving, and then you see an eye open and an ear perk up. Crane wakes up, sees him run past. You're going down! And then he jumps. Dun, 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 slow motion. He runs across it. Camera starts speeding up, pushes past the logo, and it's a split screen as the rest of the Furious 5 bust out of the entrance as Poe is screaming, "Ah!" He jumps across different statues in the garden. He flips around on Oogway's statue, does a split screen of Crane, close up and wide. Tigress is jumping across trees, and then we follow Poe as he comes down, lands on this thing. Die, filth! He jumps off the thing, does a flip through the sky, dances over top of the building, jumps down across the trees, and then another split screen as the Furious 5 are following him. He runs across some rooftops in the town. Hi-ya! 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 And then the Furious 5 are like, what's going on with him? And then it splits right down the middle as he's running across the rooftop. And he jumps. Super action intense. We're following him as he jumps on a tree at the very end, bends it down to the ground. Die! Cuts through a cloud and starts falling back to the earth. Gets super wide angle lens. Right into his eye to where you can see juices coming out of his eye. Split screen with him shooting down to the earth. Through the clouds. And blows all the customers away in his dad's noodle shop. Anyway, so that was, it was a couple of years ago now that I pitched it, and I forget exactly how I did it, but I had to pitch this thing probably 4 times, and people were roaring and laughing and cheering, and it was an amazing, amazing experience, and especially to have people receive it so well and to see it in the movie. So anyway, I'm glad I was able to share that with you. Of course, this isn't everything. There's tons and tons and tons of other work that I had done on many movies there. But working on these big projects was, although it was great and it was fun and I produced some great work like this, I didn't really feel satisfied. I didn't really know why, and I just didn't enjoy it. Like after a certain amount of time, I just didn't enjoy working on a certain kind of projects anymore. And one winter I went back to my parents' house and I was looking through my old comics and my old art, and I realized that, art it's really thinking outside the box. And I couldn't figure out exactly why I was unsatisfied with where I was in my career, or why I wasn't enjoying it, I guess. And I kept asking myself, why did I always want to be an artist? Why did I pursue art? Why did I want to do this so much as a kid? And the answer came to me when I saw my old comics. It's to tell my own stories. I wanted to tell stories as an artist. That's why I made art. I didn't just make a bunch of pictures. I always told stories with my art. And so it really clicked for me. And I don't know if that's what it is for you, but that's what it was for me. That really is the reason I wanted to do this. And so working for other people in all these great big professional careers was great, but I wasn't telling my own stories. And so back to Remind. While I was at DreamWorks, I started putting that comic that I was working on, Remind. the comic adaptation of my animation, I put that online as a webcomic because I just didn't know what to do with it. At this time, I was like, well, I made it into Dreamworks, so what do I do with this comic? And so I was like, let's just put it out as a webcomic. And, there was some problems with that because A, I had never made webcomics before. B, I'd never blogged very much before. And C, I never put my stuff online before. But my answer again, who cares? I want to do it. I love the idea of doing this, and so that's what I'm going to do. And so I started putting Remind online. It started getting some attention. I started blogging every week as well. Sure enough, people started following it. And that resulted in my fans suggesting that I do Kickstarter. Never did a Kickstarter before. It was a brand new thing. Who cares? I'm going to do it. So I did it. I also won the Xeric grant, won $5,000 from the Xeric grant for my first graphic novel. And this was all an eye-opening experience. And the reason, again, that I was able to do these things is because I was prepared, because I'd worked on stuff for years and years and years. And so when these opportunities presented themselves, I was able to jump on it. The next graphic novel was Remind 2, which was the conclusion of the story. It raised a whopping $107,000 on Kickstarter, which is still kind of a head scratcher for me. But again, it was ready and I was just able to present it at the right time. After that, I started working on Sithra. Right now, I'm about ready to pitch Sithra 4 as I record this on Kickstarter. I've also had some success with Patreon. This was a high point for my patronage. This was right after I quit my job, so there was a lot of excitement about what I was doing with Patreon. So Patreon's been a good thing. Webtoons.com approached me about Sithra because they saw that I had completed Remind and that I could tell a good story. And so they said, well, and they told me this, they said, since you've made one story good already, we know you can do another one. And so we want to offer this to you. And so they wouldn't have offered this if I hadn't finished something. So Sithra's been publishing on Webtoons. And as of recording this, I have about a month left before it's all online. So you can go to Webtoons and search for Sithra and find it there and read the whole thing for free. And so, again, it all comes back to luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. You got to love what you're doing so that you can put in the hours, so that you can finish something, so that doors can open. And that is the cycle. You repeat. And I love ending it with this quote from Proverbs 2,500-ish years ago. A hard worker has plenty of food, but a person who chases fantasies ends up in poverty. And I just want to say this because a lot of people see what I'm doing or what other artists are doing from the outside, and they don't see the hard work. They just see the fantasies that people are chasing, and they want to do it, but they don't want to put any time into it. All this stuff is hard work. It's as hard a work as anything else I've ever done, but you have to put in that time. You have to put in that work. Otherwise, if you're just going to sit there and fantasize about doing hard work, nothing will ever come from it. Disney won't come knocking on your door and give you $1 million movie deal because of an idea you have in your mind. You know what I'm saying? You have to first finish an idea, prove to people you can make that idea, and then something will come to you and give you an opportunity. And then eventually, after doing this a bunch of times, Disney might come to you and give you $1 million for your next idea. But you have to first put in the hard work. And so to wrap up the power of personal projects, just this year, I've been hired to write, draw, and color a comic for a studio. It's kind of a really big deal for me. It's the first time I've ever been given that kind of responsibility. There's a lot of weight on my shoulders. It is a project that they're using the comic as a launching pad to try to sell the movie rights and toys and make it into a big franchise and all that stuff. And for whatever reason, they're trusting me. I believe it's because of the power of personal projects. I've completed enough personal projects now to prove to people that I can take this idea and run with it and deliver. And so for whatever reason, it always seems to come full circle. Whenever I focus on a personal project and I complete it and I finish it and I keep doing that cycle, new doors keep opening up. And so I'm excited to see what's next. Of course, I will keep wanting to jump back into personal projects as the years go on because that's what opens up all the doors. So you guys keep your personal projects alive. don't let anyone tell you that they are not valuable, because they are. It's the bread and butter. This is the thing that's going to launch your career, in my opinion. It's the thing that's launched my career ever since I was a kid, was personal projects. So there you go. That's my speech. So keep making those personal projects, guys. I'll see you next time.